Well, everybody, it's Sunday. That's time for a weekend video. Get ready. Well, I'll tell you, recently somebody asked me why some Christians refuse to accept the gospel of peace and grace. And and I basically had one answer. It depends on how legalistic they are, because the more legalistic they are, the more they're going to reject it. And there's a simple reason why they do that. And they blind themselves. You know, prior to the cross, it was God who actually blinded people and hardened their hearts so that they would not believe and be converted. But after the cross, the mystery of salvation was Jesus Christ, and that was revealed, and no more blinding was going on. And but Paul says anybody who is still blinded to the new covenant of peace and grace, it's because they're reading the law of the commandments as though it's still in effect. And being obedient and subservient to the law of the commandments is actually called the ministry of death and condemnation. He says so in 2 Corinthians, so let me point that out to you. It says, so, first of all, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, from the beginning of the chapter through the middle, he's talking about how the Old Covenant, specifically the law of the commandments, was the ministration of death, and it was the ministration of condemnation. And Paul was then saying, though, but that the Old Covenant and its law of commandments was taken away. He says it was done away with in several times, and including in verse 7. And further down he says, though, the reason why a lot of the Jews are rejecting it is because they are blinding themselves. God's not blinding anybody at this point, because this is after the cross. They were blinding themselves. And why are they blinding themselves? He says in verse 14, he says, but their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. He's talking about the fact that to this day, years after the cross, the reason that the religious people are not accepting the gospel of peace and grace is because they are still reading the law as though it is in effect. And that is, and subservience to that law, subservience to the law of the commandments, is literally administration of death and administration of condemnation. And they're blinding themselves to the gospel of peace and grace. They are blinding themselves to the redemption of the world, where all who were dead in the first Adam were raised to life and righteousness in the last Adam, Jesus Christ. And until they realize to the full extent of the removal of the First Testament, the First Covenant, and its law of commandments, they cannot grasp the limitless peace and grace, which is actually called a covenant of peace, which was prophesied once established would never be removed. And that is through Christ, who redeemed the world. So if anybody is blinded by or unable to see the covenant of peace and grace, including the redemption of the world, and especially the redemption of the world, it's because they don't understand that the old covenant is truly old. That's why it's called old, because it's no longer in effect. It's revolutionary. Have a revolutionary week.